I would probably go with something like microservices are units of, let's say, applications that have set boundaries in how they behave. They have a specific goal on what they're supposed to do, and they expose kind of like what they do in forms of APIs so other services can talk to them.
When I think microservices, I think single responsibility pieces of code, this code that sits in isolation but solves a single thing really well.
I think those are all great explanations, but interestingly, and it also relates to how I normally describe microservices, but what you really all described is service-oriented architecture rather than microservices per se. But what I was going to say was I generally define microservices in terms, I'd start with talking about legacy applications and how we used to have, a monolithic, because we have this term monolithic, but the term monolithic never existed at the time when we were creating what we would now call monolithic applications. But what we mean now is that a monolithic application was back when we were creating like a single Java jar or a single Java application that had all parts of that application in it, such as the login, the counting, the reporting, the UI was all in the single thing. And microservices and SOA, it's just this idea that we can break it up into individual bits. And that has a lot of benefits. There's sort of deployment benefits in that I can scale into individual bits separately. And also if one bit goes down, it doesn't take the rest of things down. But there's also some other benefits, like teams can work on one of the particular microservices without affecting other teams working on other parts of the code.
So this is really important for cloud computing because if you have one monolithic application, you can't run it on a large number of computers. Even if you can buy the compute very easily in the cloud, but if your application can only run on a single machine, then then you can't utilize that. So, and running on many machines means you can utilize the compute, your application will be more resilient. And another very important aspect is team dynamics. So if your application is composed of many independent parts that can be independently replaced at any moment, that will allow to create independent teams and basically scale the development of the whole application to develop much faster.
So we talk about monoliths and microservices, right? And I truly believe that there's an in-between called a distributed monolith, right? And a distributed monolith has the capability of scaling single components quite easily, etc. However, the one difference between a distributed monolith and microservice is this idea of independent deployability, right? So for me, a microservice is independently deployable components of a larger system.
I just want to add, it's much simpler to talk about microservice architecture than microservices, to define the way of thinking and the architectural approach than what is a single microservice.
And I don't like the term micro in there because that makes people think that these should be like super tiny little services and start arguing about how many lines of code, which is not really the point. Right? It should be just services or something.
The nice part about microservices is that they do the work themselves. So they react to events. They don't actually push information or they do share information, but they don't actually push instructions to other microservices. So you're not going to have one microservice tell the other one, do this and this in the database, but instead they tell the other microservices what happened to them, and the other microservices then have the logic to react to that. The service bus in the middle is basically just replacing the monolith that you had with the service bus, and then having microservices that kind of execute what the service bus tells them to.
If you look back to like the original sort of start of microservices, one of the first stories was like Netflix. And it's quite interesting, you go and see why they started moving towards what became microservice. There's this tale of like a rogue semicolon in an SQL statement, and it took down all of Netflix's databases. And it took them, they're out for like 2 days while they fixed their databases because one person made a mistake with a semicolon. And they figured that they really need to contain such mistakes. So rather than having one database that could go in, or one server hosting all, or cluster hosting all the databases, they should separate out the databases for each separate service. And that was in a lot of ways the sort of modern start of microservices. And they did, in the end, become a lot more, what's the word I'm looking for? Not maintainable, reliable, I guess. Because, you know, they've got, and that's an interesting point about microservices. You not get reliability for free. You have to think about it. You have to think about what happens when microservice goes down. Like, does something else take over? Or like, what happens if 100 microservices suddenly come back up? Do they end up like having the sort of Stampede and Howard problem and taking down something else? So you have to build in all this stuff into the infrastructure to handle sort of edge cases with microservices. And if you do that, then you get increased reliability.